Hi everyone, I'm currently in the process of making a free bass distortion VST, and this will be inspired by a bass distortion unit popular with metal bassists for its like scooped, distorted sound. When I was coming to make this, I didn't want to use a static Waveshaper for the nonlinearity. I wanted something more interesting. If you're not familiar, a static nonlinearity is a nonlinearity that doesn't change. Basically, it only depends on the sample at that one point in time. So a common one is hyperbolic tangent, so tan H. It's still nonlinear. So the dry signal is the red sine wave. The louder we put this signal into tan H, the more it squares off. So it is nonlinear, but it doesn't depend on anything except the value at each sample. And so the opposite of this is a stateful nonlinearity. And so the opposite of this is a stateful nonlinearity. These are nonlinearities that depend on other things about the signal, the previous values of the signal. And so a common category you come across in audio is hysteresis. Hysteresis is a system that changes depending on previous states of the system. And so a common example of this is magnetic media like tape or transformers or any coils like that. They change their behavior depending on how hard they were driven in the past. So a tape might saturate easier instantaneously if it was previously saturated. And Schmitt triggers you see in electronics. These are threshold activated devices that have hysteresis, and so once you trigger them, the threshold for switching them back off is further down. The threshold moves away from you basically. So imagine the light turning a solar lamp on. Once the light gets high enough, it triggers the Schmitt trigger, but then to switch back off, it has to get much darker than it had to get light. And this stops things from flickering around the threshold. So I wanted something with hysteresis, but the maths of that can be quite horrible. If you do want to read that, I recommend Jatin Chowdhury's documentation for his Chow Tape plugin, which is great. But here I wanted something simpler. I'm not trying to model specific tape units or anything like that. I just wanted a more interesting distortion, basically. And so what I came up with after trying a few things was we have basically our input signal. We check whether it is rising or falling. And we apply either this one if it's rising or this Waveshaper if it's falling. The thing you will notice quickly if you try and do this is there is a point where this switches. The delta here is just the current sample minus the last. So we get whether it's positive or negative, tells us if the signal's rising or falling. You will notice quite quickly this changes. There is a point where this will go from rising to falling, and you will find that the functions you use won't necessarily match at that point. And so when it switches from rising to falling, you get a big step in your wave, a discontinuity, and you don't generally want that. It causes aliasing, and it betrays the point because that doesn't happen in real systems. And so the way to get around that, which wasn't very complicated, was to mix between the two functions. There are other ways where you can One way, for example, is to make your wave shaping functions equal the same thing at that point so that they blend smoothly. But for this, I wanted more flexibility, and like I say, I'm not modeling anything specific. And so what I've done is we work out if we're rising or falling. Then what happens is we have this mix, this morph state here. This is basically a mixer. Imagine a dry wet mix, but we're mixing between the rising and falling. Let's pretend we're rising, but this then tells us we've now falling. What happens then is every sample, this will change the mix slowly towards the falling side. So it basically gets pinged saying it's changed, and then the mix slowly drifts towards the side it's meant to be. And then again, once it changes again, it gets pinged, the direction changes, and it starts drifting towards the other side. Now this seems to work quite nicely, but there's a few things I wanted to test about it in a bit more of an interactive way, and that is the coefficient, how fast it moves between, how fast the mix changes between the sides, because that will be dependent on the input signal. If you can imagine a very slow signal, so a low frequency, this will have more than enough time to drift all the way over to the other side and stay there for a bit before the direction changes. Then it can drift all the way back, and it has lots of time to do that. In a high frequency signal, it might not, so it might change back while it's still drifting. And so with a really fast signal, you might never get the other half of the Waveshaper. And so I've tried a few things, and I ended up in Reaper, actually, in JS. That's the built-in scripting language, and you can make plugins sort of things in there. And so I copied the code exactly in here. I added 2 sliders. The only difference is there's no tan-H built in to JS. You can obviously construct it from exponents, but I didn't. I'm just using a Waveshaper for each side. The falling Waveshaper gets 10 times the input. But this is nice because we can test it and see the results live. So ignore saying tremolo. I didn't know how to make a blank plugin, so I just overwrote another. But we can see all of our variables, and we can change. This is the coefficient here. So we can see, here's our drive. You can see the difference in rising and falling. Falling, rising. If we change the coefficient, we change how long it takes to drift between. So we can see if the coefficient makes the change really fast, we get the problem we started with, which is these functions don't equal the same thing at the point they change, so you get the step. If we make the functions more gentle, so it mixes slower, we start to see this mix look, where we mix between the two, the rising and falling. And we can test that live. And of course, just for the sake of it, let's make these a bit more interesting. Let's try with sine, so like a wave folder on the falling. If I sin, and we can recompile and build, and that's already done, which is very nice. Let's get our oscilloscope back, which is from Melda Production, their free bundle, which is great. And here we go, drive this. We can see our rising is our our static Waveshaper. Our falling is the sine wave folder. And we can change the blend again here. But yeah, I just thought this was a nice use of the JS plugin thing in Reaper. And yeah, thanks for watching. Let me know if you've got any questions.